Well, we're back and starting up again with Lloyd Griffin, Frigate Marine Services, Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And Lloyd's going to speak to us about all things metal. Lloyd?
All right, thank you, Randy. As many of you know, I kind of have a little bit of a range of background experience. Our current role is the NAMS Regional VP, which, you know, a couple of weeks ago, we attended our national meeting in Mobile, Alabama. During those meetings, they give you a variety we give you different disciplines in which we all participate in. And so when Randy asked me to participate in the meeting back in December after he attended our regional meeting in Norfolk, hopefully y'all will come and attend because it's a pretty good day and a half event with 12 CEs. It gives us an opportunity. One is to improve ourselves as surveyors, but it also gives us an opportunity to socialize and strengthen our organization a little bit better. So Randy's challenged me with metal damage investigation repairs by the numbers, NAVSEA, NAVSEA Code of Standards. So that was a pretty wide-ranging topic. However, in the past couple of weeks, I've got to do some of the same things Randy asked me to look into. So I'm going to start out with this picture of the Belle of Thompson. The jewel of the fleet, carries 39 passengers to 49 passengers every day, back and forth, hanging off. It's like I consider this boat like going down Bourbon Street. They're just hanging out and having a good time. Coast Guard comes in, does an inspection. The vessel, the uniqueness of it is the vessel was built as a 10 by 30 work barge out of 11 gauge metal. It's pretty significant because what 11 gauge metal is, it's not 1/8, it's a little bit greater, which is a base metal of about 0.140. So we started looking at what are we going to do and how we're going to do this, because the Coast Guard gave instructions that this vessel would not pass survey if it was less than 0.180. Well, 0.180 is 3/16 plus or minus, you know. So all of a sudden, we had the challenge to audio gauge or gauge this hull. So the next picture is the criteria. So usually when I go to a vessel, I'll take the criteria, which I know are the vessel sizes. So you'll see we have 1/8 inch metal at 25% waste, which makes that 98, or somewhere plus or 90. 187 3/16. It gives me 140, and 250 is 187, which is 3/16. So that is my range in which I will use as I start gauging this boat. So all of a sudden, the Coast Guard has been underneath the bottom of the boat, and they found all these problems. Pitting, gauges. There's a section right here. Sorry about this. I cut this picture off. But they had already had the customer strip all the paint off. So earlier in Randy's challenge or task was, where does the NAVIC and where does NAVSEA standards fit on this non-conforming boat? It's 11 gauge down the center. It's 1/8 gauge in the wing walls because it had added width for stability, and then it had a bow and a stern added to it. So she was truly bastardized. So we shot the audio gauge for the gauging of this boat, and here is the gauge readings. I thought I had it up here. So this is kind of the report I gave. I had to define a little bit about what metals were underneath for the boat. This is the boat. This is where they cut the transom out because the Coast Guard said this was already bad. So we set the boat up on a 12 by 12 grid.
They said that was already bad?
They had already cut. The Coast Guard had already identified their areas where they wanted to finish the boat. Okay. So what we did is the assignment was the letter or the captain of the port issued a statement. We want the vessel gridded on a 12 by 12 grid. It doesn't matter how many shots you get, but we want it on 12 by 12. So we started doing the grid. So there's the keel coolers we had to deal with, back to the same random sampling, the areas of how we did the grids, pitting that we found. So we put
You did samples
every 12 inches.
Yeah, but within that 12, you did 2?
No, usually it was 12, 12, 12, 12, and then we stopped. So here's the profile of the boat.
Well, I know, but did you do soundings twice in that one 12-inch grid?
Whatever it took to get it done. So we would add samples or we would add numbers in to make it work. So here's what the boat looked like. This is every 12. So we started right here at the bow, and which is 0, or it could be 1 depending on how you set up your table. And then we went right on through. And as you can start seeing some of the numbers on the starboard side here, you see the one, this is 100, 125, 125, 125, but the numbers 12 inches out were 160, 175, 165. So, can you turn that light down? There we go. Does that help a little bit?
Yep.
Okay. So as you can see, what we did is, as the shape of the boat got wider, this is the port side of the boat, this is the starboard side of the boat, and this is down the center line of the keel. So once you got to the center of the intersection of the keel, you just kind of made that work out. Well, the Coast Guard had already identified these areas were going to be cut out because of holes in it on the starboard side, on the port side of the boat. The starboard side, we identified other sections that had to be removed. And as you can see, pretty time consuming to put this together. And of course, my dumb ass in my Cygnus unit, it stopped recording during the middle of it, but I did have an assistant that day to help me do this. But the significance of these numbers is, remember, we said our magic number was 185, 180. We said this was all new plate in one of the pontoons where they had replaced it. If you look down here, it's 135, 140. So this is all the old metal that had yet to be replaced. Well, so now, Randy, you can turn it back on. So now what we were challenged with is, what do we do from here? Come on. See where it is. So in Randy's presentation, just bear with me. Okay. So Randy asked a little bit about requirements for welding and brazing procedures. This is the NAVSEA standard numbers for the requirements. On pages 108 afterwards, it gives you the references of how they would like to see this repair made. The NAVIC, which is the Navigational and Vessel Inspection Circular, this gives you a more layman's terms of what you expect and how you're going to do your inspection and how you're going to make the hull repairs. I just cut and pasted some of this just because it was enough to get through this presentation. But when you get to the extended and degree of deterioration, this is what the Coast Guard was on this fellow about. He was more worried about how much deterioration. I was not asked to go inside. That was not my assignment. It was only on the outside of the set. So we had to present this to the captain of the port. The captain of the port and the Coast Guard inspectors made their determination of what was going to be the scope of work to be done to issue to the welder. Unfortunately, it got out of hand, and I don't know where it is now today.
Still sitting there, probably.
It could be. But as we move forward as a surveyor, we have to understand what the Coast Guard would require. As you can see, I just copied a bunch of junk in here. Didn't know where I could fill.
What article is that? You said it.
NAVIC. Yeah, it's in the NAVIC. Oh, let's see here. 768, isn't it?
Page 108.
No, that's in the NAVSEA. Yeah. Okay. So the Coast Guard and NAVSEA and the NAVIC has a specific requirement that has to be met. The plate cannot be any smaller than 16 by 16 inches. That has to be removed. And I got to pull a picture up that I've got on an aluminum boat that I forgot to add in here. So this plate, as you can see, has to have radiuses. 16 by 16 is what they recommend. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller. If you have a pinhole, they will not let you clad weld it up. It has to come out. Unfortunately, that becomes a major hardship for some people. Whoever does steel work, they understand that, hey, look, we've got interferences we have to deal with. We have tanks, we have piping, lagging, different sections of the vessel. And now with Subchapter M, they're not allowing any doublers underneath the bottom. They're not allowing any doublers over fuel tanks. You could get a patch, temporary patch. They're not allowing temporary patches in fuel tanks because of that. This is a picture of what a doubler or a patch plate would look like, is where the metal's been cropped out and they'll come and put a doubler in here and weld both sides of it. And that will get you by for a hatch ring or door frame. That's it now.
Not on the bottom.
Not on the bottom. Now, sometimes there is a C-chest valve in the bottom where they'll allow a doubler because they need the meat for the C-chest valve to attach to the bottom to hold it up.
They do double the rudders and stuff too.
Right. So at the end of this, they give you this percentage of waste. So if you do the math in your head, you can more or less pull parts out. But this is their chart. This is how the Coast Guard determines what percentage of waste is allowable and what's not. So that's why when the guy said 0.180, he felt that the boat should have been built to ABS standards, which it was not because of the conversion. And so he was allowing 1.80. As you can see, there was not much 1.80 in that whole boat except for that one pontoon that was added and had been reworked. Unfortunately, my customer, like I said, I can't really understand what he was up to. So we'll talk a little bit about this towing vessel hull inspection repair standards. I found this the other day. It's a really great reference. It's put on by AWO, which is American Waterways Association. What they've done is they've compiled a list of kind of how to fix things, and what they're doing is they're moving you to the next level of how to make your repairs, who to call, notify in the Coast Guard. It's called a bridging abatement program, and that report has been pretty significant in what I was looking for to talk about today. It's online. I'll get you though. Yeah, it was. I'll pull that up. So I found this one too, weld inspection and repair. So once we do the repairs and inspect the areas, we got a number of tools that we're having to use. Now, how many of you have been to a welding class, got certified and all that? So we know what the gauges are, we know what the angle gauges. And when it says it looks like a roll of quarters, the dude knows what he's doing. When it looks like bubble gum hanging out, it's full of porosity. Looks like snot coming out of your nose. Yeah. So unfortunately, this is what we have to use for types of inspection tools. We have magnetic particle tests where we will magnetize it, then we'll put some powder over top of it, then it'll show you a crack. Then we've got non-destructive, we got the dye penetrant, which is the nastiest of all, which is this material here, looking for a crack. We do a lot of that on price chefs, don't we, John? Looking for a crack in the hub, making sure that we'll have a twist or some kind of separation of the beach marks. And then this is the magnetic particle. Yeah. So you're seeing there where they put the graphite and it looks around and you can tell whether you got a crack or not in the weld. And then the other is an X-ray, I believe. There where we're actually X-raying the weld or we're doing the water test. I know I'm a little bit fragmented here on this, but we're going to get to the other part. That is. So let's go back to these pictures. So this was this is a uninspected 120-foot Broward motor yacht. Make that picture just a little bit bigger for you. What happened 2 weeks ago is I did a not so much of a pre-purchase survey, but an inspection of the boat, and then the insurance company said, we want to see an audio gauge of the hull. If you looked around the bow thruster, this was a hydraulic bow thruster. It had zincs across the whole bottom. But you start seeing these white spots. Earlier, the conversation was, what kind of corrosion is that? Poultice corrosion. Now, why do you have poultice corrosion on the outside of a hull? We were losing current, was leaching the outside through the bottom paint and the epoxy coatings. And so all of a sudden, when I did this area, which read 120, that was 225, but directly behind it, it read 130. So I hit a bulkhead. I found a tank. What do you think was going on in the tank? Did we have corrosion from, it was a gray water tank? Was it a holding tank? Or was it a water tank? I didn't know because I didn't have a set of scantlings. So when you go on board the vessels, it doesn't matter whether it's inspected or uninspected, you need to have a set of scantlings. So when you want to understand what's going on. Now, using the thermal camera here, which I did not pull this picture up, you could see that tank grid or when you're underneath the bottom, you can take your hammer and you can tap out the grid of the system itself. Right now, we think we're going to have to replace probably about 40 square feet in the bottom of this boat. And then directly back in the master stateroom, we had the same type of conditions found. So how many of you done aluminum boats and do them on a regular basis, where the first thing you do is you'll start up here and you'll get a 0 reading, and you'll come here and you get at the waterline, you get another 0 reading, and then you come 6 inches below the waterline, you get a 250 reading, which is 1/4 inch plate. What's happened is that these fairing people have put 1/4 inch of fairing or 1/2 inch of fairing just to make these yachts look smooth. Well, on the commercial application, we could care what they look like. But when you try to read this, you can't read it, and you can't perform destructive testing. So this is an area from about 8 inches below the waterline to above the waterline to the top. You can't gauge unless you start doing some destructive testing, which they don't. And then you'll start reading your normal numbers as a grid pattern you just saw on that vessel. The problem that we have is when we go look inside, it looks just like this. Look how pretty that is. So part of the poultice corrosion that we find in a lot of the boats is that we'll have water laying in here, we'll have wood chips, we might find rags, anything that's going to create a corrosive condition, which earlier we talked about passivation, as you were saying. So these areas that you start seeing, the drier the bilge, the better off you are. But what happens inevitably underneath of a shower or underneath of a toilet? You'll get some kind of acid, you will get some kind of contamination, you'll get soap, any kind of dishwasher, and it's going to break that passivation off of that. You'll start seeing small, like we saw on the outside, you'll start seeing small dots. This one here didn't have many. But on an inspected vessel, as soon as the Coast Guard sees that one little dot, the first thing he does, he digs out his little pit gauge and he starts gauging. When he starts gauging, he is pretty serious about his program. He's telling you that you eventually, pit gauge. So you were looking at the depth. Well, let me get over in front of Kathy. So when we're actually gauging, what we're doing is we're looking for the depth of the pit. And if it is on the outside of the boat, we determine that the bottom of the vessel was 0.25. And if we find anything at 0.187, that one pit in an inspected vessel will trigger another set of tests where you'll start looking at how much more is pitted and will they let you clad weld a small hole size of a dime or a quarter. It does happen. They do give you those opportunities, but it's very rare. This vessel here belonged to East Carolina University. It's the Stanley Riggs. The Coast Guard went and did their annual inspection, and there was a pinhole underneath of a water tank. So how did a pinhole get underneath the water tank of this boat? There was a vent on the side where the water went in. It laid underneath the water tank, no bilge pump. There's a bilge pump ahead of it, but there was not. So when we opened up the void to crawl in there, we found that the bilge pump wires were laying in the bilge, causing the corrosion to the system. One pinhole ended up causing 4 pinholes, which meant that we were going to have to take, and I'll show you the actual bottom pane itself and the grid how we did this. This was going to cost about $40,000 of repairs to a small 27-foot or 32-foot research vessel, which was not suitable for its intended use. All this pitting and stuff that we saw was just bottom coat pitting, which was a regular traditional anti-fouling paint for an aluminum boat, epoxy coated. But the Coast Guard was so adamant they would not let us do a clad weld underneath the bottom of the boat. The holes were no bigger than a quarter. I bet you could drove a wooden pencil in the holes and it'd been fine. Put some 5200 on it, kept on going. If it was a regular survey boat around the bay, that's all they would have done. Put a screw in it, a little bit of JB weld, patch it on the inside, outside, wire brush it, little glass, and call it good. Coast Guard is different. You saw where the standards is. With the Coast Guard, when you're carrying passengers, the rules change also because it's a safety of life issue. So one pinhole, which could not be stop the leak, they trigger that as a safety issue. And so now when you have a marine inspection or marine casualty, this triggers a whole another level of heat. And so this boat here has been sitting on the bank for almost, what's that date, 2016? Since that date in November 2016, not in service. Because the Coast Guard said cannot be returned to service.
What are they gonna do with it?
I don't know. That's not my problem today. So as you can see on this boat, what we did is we set up a small grid. We set it up on a 3-foot grid because the Coast Guard said, okay, we can do that. The Coast Guard gave me a lot of trouble because I was using the old wet the hull technique instead of using the coupling. Well, what happens with coupling, dry anti-fouling, it just soaks in just like your skin. It absorbs the coupling. So you really can't use coupling. So we use water a lot because what we're doing is we're trying to get the surface back wet, which will receive, and you can use water as a coupling. It doesn't matter what surface it is. It's better coupling than the regular traditional stuff, but it gives you a surface because you've rehydrated the anti-fouling paint because it's dried out. If you try, and then sometimes you can't hydrate it enough, and then you got to go to sand and bottom paint off. But I'm lazy, and I try to be very specific in doing these jobs because it's really painful when you got to sit in and grind a couple hundred shots. As you can see where the anti-fouling paint was chipped off, where we scraped it off to see what kind of adhesion we had. And then as you can see, this was the area where we were done it. The Coast Guard was worried about cracks right along that edge there. So they thought with the corrosion, we were going to have a crack, and we didn't find any crack in it. This was the general area here, what we're doing. So this was an area, this was the end of the area. So there was a bulkhead, which was right here. So this was the bulkhead. This was the area in which was going to have to be propped out. So that's when the customer said, hey, look, we're done. We'll worry about this. We'll just send us an invoice and we'll let you know. This tugboat, the next boat is another, that was inspected. Now this is an uninspected vessel. We could not get readings through that anti-fouling paint. So I had to hire somebody to come and grind about 800 shots to do this boat. This boat had doublers in the fuel tank. A year later, it sprung a leak in the boatyard after they determined that the fuel tanks filled up with seawater, and they kept pumping the seawater out, and they never could figure out where the leak was until they hauled it out. And then overnight, it put 400 gallons of diesel fuel on the ground. So when you're doing these inspections, you have to be careful about doubler plates. This is why the Coast Guard has issued the initiative. No doubler plates in fuel tank areas because of accidents like this. This was close to about a $800,000 or $900,000 cleanup so far at this time because of a doubler and a crack in the weld doubler. They called the lawyers called me up and asked me what my role was in this. I said I provided a condition value survey at the time, which was a year earlier, that they were trying to sell the boat. They put it on the market for sale, in which they had audio gauge readings. It did show the doublers, but without taking the doublers off or being able to go into fuel tanks for inspection, which is not part of our job anyway, is that we were able to, we missed this one. We missed the extra heavy hitter part where the surveyors rolled. But there were other surveyors involved that were welders and responsibility of the boatyard where they did not provide suitable contamination abatement. And after the tank had been filled up, pumped, filled, refilled with fuel, nobody went in there and double checked it or turned the valves off to the tanks so they could get in there. So back to the role of the surveyor, the actual where the standards and the NAVSEA are. This boat being uninspected was under no set of guidelines. Where subchapter M now is back to where you cannot use those. I want to show you these other couple of pictures of this last boat that I did because I think this is probably the most horrific use of the Coast Guard's reaching for how they want to be the king of the kingdoms. And I met with the Coast Guard. Where was that?
USB drive.
E?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if I can find this. This was I was pretty disappointed. So I go to this boat a couple weeks ago. I look at the transom of the boat, and here was minimum of 60 feet of 8-inch, 3/8 wall aluminum pipe. Started scratching my head. Then I saw the transom cut out of it. Then I saw the exhaust pipes out of it. I saw the aluminum plate. When I got there, I looked inside the pipe and said, what's this all about? The owner of the boat did not wait for the Coast Guard to issue their notice of findings. The guy was in a hurry. I mean, he has charters booked up for this dinner cruise boat for the next months, and he had to be back in the water in a couple of weeks. The reason why I put a quarter and a penny, you saw this corrosion? Well, I put the pit gauge on some of that corrosion and also checked the audio, did the gauging on it. And I found that this pit right here, I agree, it was better than 50%, but I could have taken a 1/2-inch drill and drilled that out, and the rest of that whole piece of longitudinal stringer would have been within spec. The customer bought the boat in, I'm not sure if it was on Lake Okeechobee or somewhere at an auction. And so through the past couple of years, he's been getting parts and pieces out. But as you can see, there's other corrosion starting. This pulses corrosion in this aluminum boat. Right now, I do not, the tubing itself, the best I can figure, was close to $20,000 just in aluminum tubing for this. Another thing that we look for on these aluminum boats, we look for erosion. This is a standpipe here. You see the corrosion here in these areas. So what's happening is that when we survey these boats, it's very difficult to look at everything because, as we say, we're here for a limited period of time. I mean, we don't get to see all of it, but we try to do the best we can. But something like this, when the Coast Guard goes and does their inspection, there's usually an accountability part of who is the responsible party to assist this customer in this. But the significance of this is this here was just a matter of time before it went leaking. And it's just, I mean, the Coast Guard did their job, they went and did their inspections, and that's part of it. I mean, so we have to, as surveyors, we have to be there. And the problem is, when I saw this, I was just being nosy. I was just trying to educate myself, because when Randy said, hey, look, can you come talk to us a little bit about metal corrosion, a little bit about what the NAVSEA and the standards are. As you can see that this here was still welded pretty good because this was on the outside of the hull. But on the inside, you can see where all the corrosion and on that nipple, it started to deteriorate pretty significant. I was hoping, this is the culprit to why all the tube was cut out. From here to here was about 8 inches. You see all the corrosion up in this area through here? The Coast Guard told the customer that his exhaust system was bad. And you see the red crayon marks. That's because that's the Coast Guard's mode of operandi, that they'll mark it up in red, and then you have to figure out what they mean by that. You have to be interpretive of their Coast Guard language, so they explained to them that they had to do that. Well, if a surveyor had been working with the customer, this is a service that you can provide as kind of as a consultant, but also kind of as a liaison between the Coast Guard and the customer, because the first thing the customer he heard, all this exhaust tubing had to be cut out. That's the first thing he heard. And all of a sudden, he got so mad, you can see they cut all the tubing out. Whereas if cooler heads would have prevailed, because this is where the muffler was, the cooler heads would have prevailed, somebody who could have sat back, talked Coast Guard language, talked customer language, and said, hey, look, can we, as we do all the time, cut this out to good metal, insert rubber hose, which we normally do, and call it good. $800 in hose, $20,000 metal, plus how much welding time will we have to fix this. So we don't always get there at the right time, but when we get there, you start scratching your head and say, what the fuck? And this guy here, I forgot what his name was, but it was a pretty, the boy sent me his name the other day. It was a friend of his. He said, yeah, I understand you met this guy. And that's how deep it was. So we were better than 50%. So this exhaust was going to fail. It hadn't yet. And it was just a matter. The Coast Guard did their job. And being that the fella had not actually been there for a survey, this is the stern flange. You see where they cut all the pipe out? This is the generator, your dual exhaust for your, I think it had 871 and 1271s in it. So they cut all this out. So when you opened it up, they started looking at all the pitting. And of course, pitting and aluminum was pitting, and they felt that it all because of the soot and everything. However, she was coated and preserved, but the Coast Guard and the customer had already cut the transom out. This is some of the bottom that was cut out. Really looked pretty good to me. That's just part of the parts and pieces. You can see where the guy got nailed, the angle grinder, and cut it out. I kept scratching my head, so I wanted to find out exactly what the rest of the story was. This is normal pitting for me. Sandblast, painted, coated. But they started seeing this pitting and the corrosion on the inside, and they said, this is going to eventually turn into a problem. So the customer bit the bullet. I think he will have about an $80,000 repair bill when he's finished because they found other sections in the bottom of the boat. There's the pit gauge in use. As you can see that we were just at the limits in that one place. We were at 3/16 metal and we were reading 1/8 on the gauge. Kind of how that works. So I did an audio gauge or a gauge reading at 385 that told me that was at 3/8 metal. And 1/8 was, there's part of, there it is. That's part of, that was the picture. But then I rode by there the other day and it was a stack of aluminum about this high. And I just saw the cash registry going off. So here's the exhaust system that's been removed, or the mufflers, exhaust tube and flanges, transom flanges, bulkhead flanges that all had to be cut out. Because as you can see, that this watertight bulkhead had to be, so this was into the engine room, this was the exhaust to the boat, and these were the transom flanges that were put in. I hope I can find this one picture because this is the one that the Coast Guard and I argued about the other day. That's the transom. I don't know if you can see that very good or not. Thought it was going to be a better picture. Stanchion pipe for rudder. Gusset. Okay. See the amount of pitting here? You see how the dots looks like the pitting. The culprit to this, and why it was that high, is that when they drilled the limber holes in there, the limber holes were put in after the hull was built. So the limber holes did not get to the bottom. How many regular boats do we go see where the limber holes are too high up and nothing will drain, especially these custom boats? They're never in the right place. Theoretically, you didn't have to have any of these longitudinals in the back because the length of metal and the thickness of the metal would have given pretty much accurate support. So now they have to change this one non-limber hole, which was right here. I think I got a picture of it. It was right here. Caused all of this. Now, why it kept growing, I guess because the compartment was wet. They tried to come in and paint it to abate it, and that just probably made it worse because you started losing your passivation off of it. That's a little better picture of that. I was hoping. No. So the moral of the story is that aluminum and steel, as we heard earlier today, will always corrode. We will always have rust. We will always have aluminum. We will always have passivation. So I'm a little bit ahead because earlier the fellow this morning talked a little bit about corrosion, galvanic corrosion, straight current corrosion. So that kind of gets me a little bit ahead of there. So when you're doing the actual inspections, just make sure you understand what your job is. I mean, if you're not clear of what your assignment is, whether you're going to do, how many of you do audio gauging or gauging anyway? Read hull plating. Randy does, I know John does. Randy, Bill, okay. Bill, what do you see in yours? I mean, you see the same stuff, don't you? Are you doing any T-boats? Randy, you're doing T-boats, aren't you? Yeah.
I'm just doing commercial.
Commercial.
Just,
Sailboats and those little workboats?
well, I'm working right now with a 1984 Chris Craft Romer.
Right.
But I've gridded out the whole bottom. It was funny because I drew that spreadsheet you have up there on a big whiteboard.
Right.
Looked like the exact same thing I did. So, yeah, but you're right that on that side of that boat, it had that fairing product
Right.
that I had to scrape down there was one area that I've scraped down that they were going to do redo anyway.
Right.
To get the thickness that I needed. And then I used that as my
Baseline.
And then I went all the way up. Now, it was kind of obvious on some of these when the boat was sitting there. I came back in the evenings and did the bottom on the way home.
Right.
And yeah, there was a couple pinholes that leaked for about a week or two. So, there was a lot of water at the bottom of the boat. And I have not got up inside the boat yet. And I'm doing pre-purchase. So we're going to have some more issues. And the welder was somewhat to be desired. He welded it, but not as good as I would have wanted it, but it'll work.
Yeah, so what happens when you start looking for scraping paint? I had a sailboat, I can't remember what kind it was, and all of a sudden we sandblasted it, and they started sandblasting through the bottom of the boat. And as I told my customer, I says, my probe is, and your probe is only 5/8 inch in diameter, and you can read here on a grid, and you go keep going, and you might miss a spot like this, but then all of a sudden that sandblast right across of it, because maybe the boat that you have has insulation on the inside if it's a sailboat, and it's going to be in the radius of it where they poured it in or they blew it in. And so there's a lack of oxygen in there. And so what's going to happen is you're going to get the corrosion underneath of that. So when you start reading your gauging, you have to go dig sometimes on the inside to get your accurate number. You'll find that if you look in your anchor lockers and your chain lockers, that's where you'll see most of your corrosion, because you got all that chain and the galvanized metal. Just the corrosion from the chain will lay in that void pocket up there, and it will start giving you trouble. So that might be another spot you want to look at in there, because when you pull, if it's got solid chain or wet rope in there, it will be a disaster. I did a motor out like that recently. Last summer.
These guys were MIG and TIG welders. I'm an old stick welder from way back when.
Right.
I just turn off the heat and burn her in, kind of thing. But they had to block off the wind. They were using the gas. I mean, it was just, I don't know.
That means that those guys are not qualified to do the job.
Well, they said I didn't see their certificate, but they said they do a lot of work for the approved by the Coast Guard. So, and there was a couple holes that we just welded. We didn't plate.
Right.
And we didn't double plate.
Did you drill a hole to see how thick it was where they got ready to do that?
It was leaking water. Yeah. So it wasn't very thick.
So if the guy's clad well in that, all he did is put a patch over or a Band-Aid.
So the customer is buying this, may want to turn it into a party boat eventually.
Right. Oh, to a COI boat?
Yeah, and I'm going to tell him, I said, I don't think that's going to work.
Find another boat.
If it has to turn to an inspected boat, it's not going to work. Because they're going to be too stringent on there.
Well, especially if it wasn't built to a standard.
Right.
I mean,
30 or 40 years old.
Right.
It's 1985. Yeah.
They still give you troubles on that.
This was a boat. I don't know if you saw the movie Wire, or it was owned by Barbara Mandrell, and it was on the movie The Wire, or the series The Wire. It was filmed in Baltimore.
Right.
It was the boat that they used for that. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Little history.
So Bill, when you go back on your grid, whether you find those smaller the littler numbers, try to go on the inside and identify that, because you probably find water pockets along the longitudinal stringers in that boat where it's sat against it, because you'll probably be with less than 6 inches away from a longitudinal stringer.
Okay.
That's because that water will pop, whatever the level is across, that's where you'll find your water line, and that could be your areas of concern.
I just got a feeling when I get in there,
And
because all the water that was in there that was leaking out for weeks, it was probably up to the floorboards. So everything in there.
That means your fuel tanks are bad.
Huh?
That means your fuel tanks could be bad.
Yeah.
Integral fuel tanks, rusted sheet metal. So Randall, what do you, I mean, you're seeing commercial boats and your T-boats. What's the Coast Guard telling you? I mean, I'm not preaching to the choir here. I'm just, you know, it's a good education format.
My experience with them, they will not tell you how to fix the boat.
Right.
They'll point out what they see as problems. And part of your role as surveyor is not only are you gauging, usually you've got to give a recommendation on the renewal plate. The loom, that's about all you can do. But I was going to quote, you ever see the Brocraft?
Yeah.
Been building crew boats since 1940s. I got a price from them in Maryland. Bay Palms were buying a boat out of Texas, and it had similar corrosion you're talking about. It's usually low oxygen, just stale dead water. And over time, it powders out, you call white rust or whatever, with the pits. And so when you're gauging, typically externally, when you get low numbers, it's a pit.
Right.
Well, when we get back to Brocraft, the pilots really want this boat for some reason. And when you really start looking, it's like, wait a minute, this thing's a piece of wood. He said, well, give me a price on what it would take to cut out the keel string, the A string, from the bow waterline back to the engine room. Engine room was fine because all they had was stale oil, no stale water.
Right.
A lot of times fuel tanks are bad because they have stale fuel in them. Anyway, Bro said, I can build you a new boat for less than it's going to cost to fix that. I said, why is that? He says, well, for one thing, we build these boats in a building upside down. It's hard enough to weld aluminum downhand.
Right.
Okay, can you imagine welding aluminum overhead? And you just the same thing. You can't have any way. You got to have it curtained off. And cutting aluminum, you don't use a burning torch. You use
Salt.
salt.
Right.
Cutting. So anyway, so aluminum is very expensive.
I mean, that was his head boat. I mean, it's the same thing. This dude had, I'm surprised I didn't see a skill saw with the blade turned around backwards or a diamond wheel in to cut it.
Usually somebody will come along. It's not going to be inspected anymore, certified. The boat won't go away, but somebody can go with some thick paint on it. Or
Use it at private.
Right.
One thing you touched on was the corrosion limit is 25%. Some people say 20%. It's in that NAVSEA. One thing in that NAVSEA is it is instructions to Coast Guard inspectors. They say do not use audio gauging to do a quote fishing expedition.
Right.
So they're not looking for every pinhole, but it's enough for them to flag it and want you to come in and gauge it. But one thing nobody talks about is safety factor designed into a new hull for a commercial vessel. And that's why they allow you 20 to 25%, because the safety factor is a full scaling hull. You can lose 25% of that thickness and you've not lost any strength. We do design criteria.
And if it's an over scantling built boat, it's better than an under scantling boat, because the under scantling boat, they'll take it down. And once they prove it that the boat's not suitable, they'll take it down to a 5 or 10% of waste factor. Because that, I mean, I've had that happen recently too. You haven't seen that? Well, it's in the NAVIC also, whereas if the design said that it's supposed to be 1/4-inch metal, and whether they get European steel or they get Canadian metal, they get millimeter metal instead of an American gauge or thickness metal, it'll be thinner under the millimeters. So if they're going to say they're going to use 4 mil, or they want 1/4-inch metal and you might use 4 mil or 5 mil, you're going to have a range there. So that's going to be an under scantling to hull thickness, and they will check that based on the drawings of the vessel. Right, if they have the information on the schedule.
What I'm basically involved with is they want just for routine dry docking. And these are hulls that they're going to do the first dry docking.
Right.
That's what I did recently, within the last year. And you wonder why they wouldn't even have a gauge. They just wanted for the records where they have a baseline when it was new. You always do the wind water line, and you do the keels straight either side, and the transom. So, and those are the areas just by experience down by the keel because of your bilge drainage.
Right.
Battery acid.
That's what this is right there.
Sometimes your battery box is the worst call. What I try to do by experience, so you're not cutting out all the hull. You find the areas where you know it's bad, and usually those areas are corrected. The other 80%, 90% of the hulls is fine. It's usually a pattern of corrosion. It doesn't go everywhere at the same rate.
just like a wooden boat with fuzzy wood.
So,
Yeah.
Can you, you said no double plating on the outside of the bottom.
Mhm.
How
And
about
or
on the
in,
inside?
no.
Because that would be easier to weld.
no double plating
No double
on an
plating
inspected vessel.
Inspect, right?
And that's where subchapter M, that's, as I said earlier, subchapter M with the towboats is stepping up the plate now to the plate, because now these uninspected towboats are having to come into compliance with an inspected, like an ABS boat. So now we've got to, when we inspect the subchapter M boats, I just did one a couple weeks ago, one of the first ones in the area. And we have to look at the wire. If you don't have ABYC standards and you got to comply with what this Coast Guard is telling you to do, you need to have that, because it does help you understand what the new Coast Guard is doing for the tugboats. You'll see
NEC or they refer to
ABYC, and it's in the book.
That's good.
Well, I think so too. But if you get a Kunas boat that's using Romex wire and square D breaker panels, well, they're still building Kunas boats. Yeah. Well, those Battle Battery guys are building a lot of tugboats down there right now, and a lot of them in Morgan City on the bank, because the economy sucks down there. And Hornbeck sold a bunch, and Marquette and those guys have got a lot of them for sale. And I'm getting ready to open one up in a couple of weeks, and hopefully we don't see that. So
I hope that they're not going to be requiring replacement of all this stuff.
I think it's an identifiable, making sure there's not a hazard, creating a hazard. That's a little different subject.
It's open-ended. It's the repercussions of subchapter M really just started.
Yeah.
30% of the fleet's going on the beach.
Yeah. So John, what have you got in your audio gauging and stuff that you're seeing that, we're trying to help us out a little bit more with our
one
jobs?
of the things I've been seeing on some of these small T-boats and ferry boats, as an example, because we just went through our 5-year inspection. One of the biggest things was somebody had mentioned earlier about the coatings issues, mismatching coatings. Big problem, because we had a problem with that boat. The undercoater failed under a hemp paint, which was really good.
Right.
And it created thousands of pockets. And luckily we got to it early enough. It didn't create any problems with it.
So was it a solvent issue in the hemp hill paint?
It was actually what Randy's going to talk about tomorrow.
Okay.
It was a salt issue.
Right.
Not cleaning the boat, thoroughly cleaning it after the boat stripped down.
Yeah.
But those are the things that really come into play, especially in 5-year COIs when you don't see the bottom.
Right.
For a 5 year.
And that's what's happening with subchapter M. If you do, like this year, we've got to haul 3 boats in this one company to do the 25% compliance. And the Coast Guard told me all that. I said, do we have to do gauging? He says, no, you have to do visual inspection. If you see areas of suspect, you do, if you got deep pitting or you see an area of high levels of corrosion, you want to go and actually gauge it so that you'll have a record of it for the company. So the part with the salts and stuff, that's been a battle when I was sandblasting Coast Guard boats. The first thing you do, they pull the sling psychometer out, make sure that you've done that. They make sure once you sandblast it, if you got a percentage of rust, you got to go back and redo it, and you got to make sure your air is clean.
How old are you?
I was doing that for about 30 years ago, man. Back when I was 25, I was sandblasting these Coast Guard boats.
How old are you?
Yeah. So, but if you don't understand what we're talking about, what we do is on these steel boats, we'll sandblast them, and then there's a specification. And Randy, we'll talk more about it. But the sling psychometer, instead of going to the Weather Channel and say, what's the humidity? It's like I asked the Seakeeper guy, says, you're asking for buoy data, but the buoy might be 5 miles away from where you actually are. So there's an inconsistency. But the Coast Guard or the QAs, they have their own sling psychometer, and they're measuring the humidity in the air to make sure that it's less than 60% or something like that. They check your water in the air compressor, make sure it's dry, you're pumping out dry air. So you're not introducing contaminants into that paint as you spray it. Whether using an airless guns, usually don't have the problems as much as you do with air guns or air pots. Randy, you got anything to add to this?
No, I'm going to, not to take anything away from Richard Carlson.
Yeah.
To represent the head to dam.
Right.
I'm going to talk about criteria now needed. Sodium-free glass material.
Right.
Powdered glass, volcanic
Garnet.
barrel system.
Yeah.
And then measuring surface roughness very accurately, because his measuring your coating is not what we're used to.
Right. So this area, so like this area that Randy's talking about, if this boat was built, as soon as that passivation or the aluminum skin has worn off of it, we have to go in there and sandblast and coat it with something to keep it from continuing to deteriorate. So what does that cost versus just taking the saw, cutting the bottom out of it, putting on a new plate in there? You know, so there's a trade-off to the value of that versus this. It's back to what you're saying, Bill. You know, if that dude cuts that section out and he says, hey, look, we got more troubles, then you're going to be backing up and say, hey, look, we probably just need to find another boat to do what you want us to do as an inspected vessel.
Right.
I mean, because, I mean, the Coast Guard has done a pretty decent job with their T-boats, T's and K's, right? They've done a pretty good job with that so far. But in ABS with the tugs and that criteria, they at least are managing or maintaining the fleet at a standard level. And now once they put the towboats in there, the next thing is going to be fishing vessels. And as soon as they put fishing vessels in it, you won't even be able to buy a scallop in the United States anymore, because there won't be a boat to comply with the Coast Guard regulations. And
A lot of these pleasure boats aren't built, like you said, Richard, right? That they're not the Coast Guard standards for the rails, for the fuel tanks.
well, they are built. They're built when the naval architect does his set of drawings. He turns in a set of scantlings to ABS and the Coast Guard. So it has to be stamped by the engineer.
Well, that's for inspection.
No, this is for motor yachts and any vessel.
Okay.
Every vessel has to have some kind of review
Right.
by an engineer and the Coast Guard,
Okay.
whether it's passenger or non-passenger. It's just like a bayliner or a
Right, but
sea
that
ray
bayliner can't be turned into a commercial boat unless it meets other criteria.
criteria. Right. It has to meet a standard.
Right.
So it goes into service.
And this guy buying a 65-foot Roamer,
Right.
if he wants to turn into a pleasure boat, not a pleasure boat, but an inspected vessel, or use it for carrying, you know, gas. Or
More than
whatever.
6.
More than 6, right?
More than 6.
You know, the rails have to be up a certain height, the fuel tanks have to be
Right.
a certain way. I know a lot of those stuff has to be a certain way that may not meet the criteria.
Before I spend a lot of money, I'll probably get the inspector on board to kind of go through that test, because, you know, these boats that are, I mean, when we were doing the boats that leave America to go to Australia or go to Europe, they have the CEs. And Australia, for a boat to go into service, it is a god-awful test when you get there. And it has to comply before it gets there. So, I don't know. Hopefully, Randy, I answered some of your questions about NAVSEA, a little bit of in the field work. I think a lot of times we don't see this. I do have one picture. I think, let me see if I can find this. One picture is, I hope it's here. I found this one when I was doing this thing. And during our meetings in let's see, in December, we have what we call the picture tells the story. Let's see if I can find.
You won that award.
I've not won it yet. I haven't won that one. I was the instigator to put it out there on the table for this. Well, I might have found one if I can find it. No, that's not it. What I found was in this boat, and must not be on the disc. I found an aluminum boat, had a steel fitting, had a check valve with the corrosion coming out the top with PVC pipe out the other end. I thought I had it right there. It's my thing. So part of our mission here is not so much of education. It's just that how do we prevent from causing more problems for our customers, and then they don't call you up in the middle of the night cussing you out because, hey, look, why did you miss this? Because I am over it. I do have one selling point, Randy. I want to ask you this. How many of you have a seller's disclosure form? Think about this. Sorry, Randy, if I can take 2 seconds. Last year, I had 4 close calls. 4. I can tell you what all of them were about. One of them was an old custom boat. Guy calls up, carries the boat to the paint boat yard 6 months later. I didn't hear jack shit until the broker calls up and starts railing on me because I hadn't talked to the customer. Customer never called me. They removed the wood. John knows from these bumper. Carolina custom boats maintained perfectly. Pulled the screws out. The screws came out with my finger. Customer called up, said, I missed that during the survey. I said, okay. How did I miss it? Well, one is we can't do destructive testing. Is that right? So then, that's in mine. The next one on the same boat was the refrigeration unit down below wasn't cooling. Well, they turned it on that morning, so the fan was pumping. I had a picture of the fan turning. And then the electrical panel had to be rewired. Well, how the electrical panel work? So how many of you had this experience? Because it's one of those where the seller's disclosure form would have stated that the boat was surveyed a year ago or 6 months ago, and these findings should have been found or fixed. So why does it become my responsibility for that? Then it, right, because that information should have been disclosed from the broker who had already surveyed the boat once before that year or 6 months before, and did the survey and miss it, because I found that out after I did it. The next close call was a boat was surveyed in North Carolina, goes to California. And I think it was one of those little POSs that had been sitting on the bank for a while, and some hoses were cracked. And so the guy calls me up 6 months later again, says, why did you not tell me about these cracked hoses? Back to the seller's disclosure form. And the most recent one, I just have not heard from yet. I'm just waiting for this one to flare up. But so my good friend Will Robinson and I sat there a couple of weeks ago, and we said, we're going to create the seller disclosure form. So we gave it to Mr. Broker or Mr. Customer and said, you need to send this to the seller's broker. Tell the seller to write down everything about this boat that he knows. Just like when you buy a house. You don't want to know how old the roof is. You'll know when the last time the boat was hauled, when it was last had an insurance survey. Basic information that will save our ass. And we might not be on the right side of this one here, but I think I'm on the side to cover my ass a little bit more, because I don't want one of my insurance policies to have to kick in because something that I have to spend several $1,000s with a lawyer, another surveyor to go in and say, yeah, we found this. Why didn't you disclose this to this buyer? Because while we are CSI people, I mean.
Yeah, but you know, like on a seller's disclosure form or real estate even,
right,
all they gotta do is put down not known.
Right.
We understand that, but however, if
It's
you,
kind of a two-edged sword.
but if you do that though, and you can prove that, if you can go to the last time the boat was hauled out for survey, somebody around there will tell you what's going on. And it might take a little
Better
bit.
than nothing.
It's better than nothing. I told my brokers that. I said, look, boys, y'all better get ready for this, because I'm going to start sending this over, and you better get your sellers in tune with this, because there has to be, insurance companies now require surveys every 3 years, 3 to 5. They also, you know, if you're not doing your maintenance stuff, you'll know when they last hauled it out. So at least you'll have a general information of when things were last time. So thank y'all for your time and being a pain in the ass for all this afternoon. I'm going to find that damn picture, because I know John Pepe will challenge me next winter when he comes down to.
I want to know over the many years, how many non-operable microwave ovens have you had to buy?
None.
Really?
None.
You run every one of them?
I
run 9 out of 10, and the one I don't trust.
I turn every one of these damn things on. And you know what I tell the people? I said, you got a kid that can turn that damn stereo on. I said, I tell them right up, I do not turn on stereos or electronics.
I kid you not, to drop my truck right now, there's 4 bags of popcorn. Every boat I get on now, throw a bag of popcorn in the microwave. I say, what?
Take a picture of it.
Pepe, that is as good as you can ask. I wish I could find that picture. That's a pretty good one. I'm going to have to put that one in my cards of stupid shit. So I wish I could find it.
Then you can have lunch as you're going.
Smells good too.
Yeah.
Kills that head over.
Yeah. So hopefully that was some help. Maybe it was just some good insight and good enough. So